He spent his last dollars not to buy a beginning, but an end, a rusty shipping container. To him, it was a tomb for his past, but to his loyal German shepherd, he only saw his master. Neither of them knew that when the steel door closed that night, a battle for the soul would begin, and that this desperate gamble would lead to an unbelievable discovery. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The air in Oak Haven, Oregon, tasted of damp earth and pine. A heavy, gray sky pressed down on the landscape, muffling the world in a quiet hush. It was the kind of quiet Andy had driven 3,000 miles to find. A silence so profound he hoped it might finally drown out the noise in his own head. The flatbed truck groaned as it reversed onto the muddy patch of land, its tires carving deep ruts into the soil. At the edge of the lot, Andy stood motionless, a tall, lean man in his late 40s, whose worn flannel shirt and faded jeans seemed to blend into the muted colors of the autumn afternoon. The wiry strength of his past as a Marine combat engineer was still evident in his frame, but his shoulders were stooped with a weight that had nothing to do with physical burdens. His brown hair, cut short in a way that had never left him, was flecked with gray at the temples. His face was a roadmap of hardship, carved with lines of grief and exhaustion, but his eyes, a deep and weary blue, held a quiet kindness that he rarely showed the world. Beside him, watchful and still, sat Zeus. The dog was a magnificent German shepherd of about 8 years, his striking sable coat, a mix of gray and white, like a wolf's pelt, dusted with snow. A touch of silver around his noble muzzle was the only sign of his age. His temperament was that of a seasoned professional, calm, observant, and intensely loyal. He radiated a quiet confidence that his human partner had long since lost, his golden eyes fixed on the massive, rust-colored box being prepared for unloading. The truck driver, a man in his late 50s with a weathered face and a plaid jacket, operated the crane with practiced ease. He glanced at Andy, his expression a mixture of professional detachment and quiet curiosity. He had delivered strange things to strange places, but a man who looked like a ghost setting up a shipping container in the middle of nowhere was a new one. "All right, that's about where you marked it," the driver called out, his voice cutting through the silence. "You sure about this spot? Once it's down, it's down." Andy just nodded, unable to summon the words. The screech of metal followed as the crane hoisted the 20-foot container into the air. For a moment, it hung suspended between the gray sky and the brown earth, a coffin-like object casting a long shadow. Then, with a deafening, final thud, it settled onto the ground. The impact seemed to shake the very air, a period placed at the end of a long, miserable sentence that had been his life in Ohio. This was it. The last of the money from the sale of his mother's house, the house where he had grown up, was gone. It had not been spent on a new start or a wise investment. It had been burned away, first in the haze of countless bottles of whiskey that did nothing to numb the guilt, and now on this, a steel box. A self-imposed prison meant to keep the world out and his demons in. The driver secured his equipment, his movements efficient. He walked over to Andy, holding out a clipboard. "Just need your signature here, sir." Andy took the pen, his hand steady despite the tremor deep inside him. He scrawled a name that felt like it belonged to someone else. "Good luck to you," the driver said, his tone softening slightly as he looked from the solitary man to the loyal dog. He chose not to ask any questions, pocketed his copy of the paperwork, and climbed back into his cab. The roar of the diesel engine shattered the quiet one last time before fading down the gravel road, leaving behind only the whisper of the wind through the tall fir trees. Andy and Zeus were alone. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier than before. It was the silence of absolute endings. The slammed door of his sister Sarah's house. The sterile, quiet hum of the hospital room where his mother had taken her last breath. The silent 3-day drive west, with nothing but Zeus and the ghosts in his passenger seat. Andy ran a hand over his face, the rough stubble scratching his palm. He walked toward the container, his boots sinking into the soft ground. Zeus padded silently beside him, his presence a warm, solid comfort. Andy reached the steel wall and placed his hand against its cold, rough surface. The rust felt like dried blood beneath his fingertips. This was not a home. It was a declaration of surrender. With a grunt, he pulled on the heavy locking bars. The hinges shrieked in protest as the massive door swung open, revealing a dark, cavernous interior. The smell that wafted out was of stale sea salt, rust, and decay. Andy stepped inside, his footsteps echoing with a hollow clang that seemed to vibrate through his bones. Zeus followed, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the metal floor as he explored the new territory with a curious sniff. As dusk settled, the temperature inside the box plummeted. Andy laid out his thin military-issue sleeping bag on the floor, the only bedding he owned. He had no food, only a gallon jug of water and a small bag of high-quality kibble for Zeus. He had made sure of that. Whatever else happened, Zeus would eat. He sat down, his back against the corrugated wall, and pulled his knees to his chest. And as the darkness became absolute, the fight began. It started as a low hum in his blood, a familiar craving that quickly grew into a physical ache. His hands started to shake. A cold sweat prickled his skin. His body, so long accustomed to being saturated with alcohol, was screaming in protest. It was a physical torment matched only by the mental one. The image of his mother's face, pale and weary in the hospital bed, flashed in his mind. He remembered her looking at him, her eyes filled not with anger, but with a deep, bottomless sorrow. He had been there, but he hadn't been present. His mind clouded by drink, his words slurred. He had failed her. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He let out a ragged sob, the sound swallowed by the cavernous dark. He was nothing, a failed son, a failed brother, a failed man. The urge to run, to walk until he found a town, a bar, anything to make it stop, was overwhelming. Just then, he felt a wet nose nudge his hand. A heavy head rested on his knee. Zeus whined softly, a low rumble in his chest. Andy opened his eyes and looked down at the loyal silhouette beside him. The dog shifted, curling his large body tightly against Andy's, sharing his warmth without reservation. He was a steady, living anchor in the swirling chaos of Andy's mind. Andy wrapped a trembling arm around the dog's neck, burying his face in the thick, gray and white fur. Zeus did not flinch. He simply leaned into the embrace, a silent sentinel guarding his broken soldier through the long, cold night. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Andy wasn't entirely alone in the fight. Dawn inside the container was not a gentle awakening. It was a cold, metallic reality that seeped into Andy's bones. He woke each morning on the hard floor to the same trio of miseries: a pounding headache, a churning stomach, and hands that trembled with a life of their own. The first conscious thought was always the same: a desperate, clawing need for the false warmth of whiskey. It was a monster that lived inside him, and it woke up hungry. The first week bled into the second, and a grim routine took hold. This was not a life, but an existence measured in small, painful victories. With the few dozen dollars he had left, he had bought the barest of essentials: a large bag of rice, a sack of dried beans, a canister of propane for a small camp stove, and a 20-pound bag of premium dog food. The math was simple and brutal. The dog ate well. Andy ate just enough to function. His world shrank to the size of the vacant lot. Each morning began not with a choice, but with a duty. A low whine from Zeus, a nudge from a cold, wet nose, and the silent demand in those intelligent golden eyes were his alarm clock and his conscience. The dog needed to go out, so Andy would pull on his worn boots, his body aching with the chill of withdrawal, and force himself through the heavy steel doors into the pale Oregon light. They walked the same path every day, a perimeter patrol around the forgotten piece of land. Andy grew thinner, the hardship carving away at his already lean frame. His face became gaunt, his blue eyes sunken and haunted. He kept his head down, his worn flannel shirt pulled tight against the damp air, a solitary figure moving through the morning mist. It was on these walks that he became aware of the neighbors. They were distant figures in the landscape of his isolation. A curtain would twitch in the window of a tidy blue house 100 yards away. A pickup truck would slow almost imperceptibly as it passed the entrance to his lot. There was no hostility, just a watchful, cautious distance. They saw a man who had appeared from nowhere, a man who lived in a box and looked like he was at war with himself. One house in particular caught his attention. It was a modest, well-kept home with a garden full of late-blooming roses. Most mornings, a woman in her late 60s was out in the yard, tending to her plants. She was slender, with short, neat white hair, and a face that seemed both gentle and observant. Sometimes, their eyes would meet across the distance. She would offer no wave, and he would give no nod. There was only a quiet, mutual acknowledgement of presence before Andy would lower his gaze and continue on his path, with Zeus pacing faithfully at his heel. He did not know her name was Rachel. To him, she was just the woman in the rose garden, a silent witness to his daily struggle. The days were long. Andy did little more than basic cleaning and organizing inside the container, his movements slow and deliberate. The real work was internal. The craving for alcohol came in waves, sometimes a dull ache, other times a furious, screaming tempest that threatened to tear him apart. He fought it with the only tools he had, grim determination and physical exhaustion. He would do push-ups until his arms gave out. He would walk circles around the container until his legs ached, anything to keep his mind and body occupied. But his most powerful weapon in this silent war was Zeus. The dog's needs provided a structure that addiction had long since demolished. Zeus needed to be fed at 7 in the morning and 5 in the evening. Zeus needed fresh water. Zeus needed their daily patrols. These were not suggestions. They were non-negotiable orders. They were the backbone of his shattered life. Late one afternoon during the 3rd week, the war nearly ended in defeat. A relentless, chilling rain had been falling all day, trapping him inside the echoing steel box. The dampness magnified the cold, and the relentless drumming on the roof was like a hammer against his skull. The craving hit with the force of a physical blow, bringing with it a suffocating wave of despair. The memories of his mother, of his sister Sarah's tear-streaked, angry face, flooded his mind. What was the point of this? This slow, cold, miserable fight? The warmth of forgetting was just a few miles away, in the town he could see glowing faintly in the distance. He lay on his sleeping bag, curled into a ball, shaking. He was done. He would wait for the rain to stop, and then he would walk away from it all. From the container, from the memory, from the fight. He closed his eyes, ready to surrender. A moment later, he felt a familiar weight press against his back. Then, a loud metallic clang echoed through the container. Andy opened his eyes. Zeus was standing over him and had just dropped his empty steel food bowl onto the floor. The dog stared down at him, head cocked, and let out a soft but insistent bark. It was 5 o'clock. It was dinner time. The simple, unwavering expectation in the dog's eyes cut through the fog of his despair. This creature depended on him. This loyal soldier, who had stood by him through everything, was counting on him for his next meal. The self-pity shattered, replaced by a profound sense of duty. Slowly, painfully, Andy pushed himself up. His hands trembled as he scooped a measure of kibble into the bowl. He set it down, and as he watched Zeus eat with quiet satisfaction, a single, powerful realization settled over him. He might have given up on himself, but he could not, would not give up on his dog. In the dim light of the container, the silent war had been fought, and for one more day, it had been won. The hope that had sustained Andy through the initial weeks was a fragile thing, and by the end of the first month, it had worn dangerously thin. The reality of his situation was as stark and cold as the steel walls that surrounded him. His financial resources, already meager, were now gone. One morning, he turned the nearly empty bag of rice upside down, collecting a final, dusty handful. He counted the change in his pocket for the 10th time. $3.41. He looked at the bag of Zeus's food, which was perhaps a quarter full. The math was a death sentence to his project. He stood in the center of the container, the hollow space amplifying his own emptiness. He looked at the bare walls, the uneven floor, the places where he had imagined putting a bed, a small kitchen, a chair. The entire idea now seemed like a madman's fantasy. A home? He couldn't even afford to feed his dog for another week. How could a man who had failed at everything, a man who had burned through his inheritance and been cast out by his own family, possibly think he could build anything from nothing? The familiar monster stirred in his gut, the craving. This time, it did not feel like a simple, physical need. It felt like a logical solution. It whispered to him with venomous clarity, "This is impossible. You have failed. Just like you always do. Your sister was right. Your mother, she would be so disappointed. There is only one thing that can make this stop. One thing that has always worked." The voice was persuasive. The thought of oblivion, of a few hours where the guilt and the failure and the cold would all disappear, was an irresistible siren song. "Stay," he said to Zeus, his voice a rough rasp. The dog, who had been lying quietly, lifted his head, his ears perked. He let out a low, questioning whine, sensing the shift in Andy's demeanor. Andy did not look at him. He couldn't. He turned, pushed open the heavy door, and stepped out into the gray afternoon, pulling the door closed behind him. He started walking, his boots crunching on the gravel road. He had no destination in mind, only a direction, toward the distant hum of civilization, toward the town of Oakhaven. Each step was heavy, as if he were wading through thick mud. The wind cut through his thin shirt, but he barely felt the cold. The war was entirely inside him now. Images and voices swirled in his mind. The sharp, disappointed anger in his sister Sarah's eyes the last time she saw him. "I can't watch you do this anymore, Andy. Not around my kids." The quiet weeping of his mother behind her closed bedroom door. The scornful looks from former employers. Each memory was a stone, and he was drowning under their weight. He walked for what felt like an eternity, his gaze fixed on the asphalt ahead. Cars passed him, their occupants faceless strangers living lives he could no longer comprehend. He was a ghost, haunting the edge of their world. Finally, he reached the outskirts of town, and there it was, a squat, single-story building with a faded sign in the window. A flickering neon light, pale in the daylight, spelled out the word Spirits. It stood at a crossroads, a beacon promising shelter from his inner storm. He stopped, standing on the opposite side of the road, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could almost taste it, the familiar burn of cheap whiskey sliding down his throat. He could feel the blessed numbness that would follow, the slow, welcome death of feeling. His hand went to his pocket, touching the few coins and the crumpled dollar bills. It was enough. It would be enough to silence the ghosts, at least for a little while. He took a step toward the road, his body moving on instinct, and then he closed his eyes. The neon sign vanished. In its place, he saw the inside of the container, dark and cold. He saw Zeus, lying exactly where he had left him, his magnificent head on his paws, his eyes fixed on the door. He saw the dog's ears twitch at every distant sound, waiting, listening for the footsteps of the one person in the world he trusted. Zeus, who had followed him into this desolate life without question, who offered nothing but silent, unwavering loyalty. The thought of not returning, of betraying that absolute trust for the contents of a bottle, was a physical shock, like a punch to the gut. He staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. As he recoiled from that image, another memory rose up, unbidden and sharp with detail. His mother, not her sick, weary face in the hospital, but her face a year before that, sitting across from him at her kitchen table. He had come over for dinner, already half drunk. He couldn't remember the conversation, but he would never forget her eyes. They weren't angry or scolding. They were filled with a quiet, profound heartbreak, the look of a person watching a beloved son slowly erasing himself from the world. That look of gentle, devastating disappointment was a pain far sharper, far more real than the temporary agony of withdrawal. He had failed her then. He could not fail her again. The battle was over. The craving, which had been a raging inferno moments before, subsided, leaving behind only the cold, gray ash of exhaustion. He turned his back on the flickering sign and the false promises within. Tears streamed down his face as he walked back toward the lot, but they were not tears of self-pity. He wept for his mother's sorrow, for his sister's anger, for the loyal dog waiting for him, and for the broken man who was still, somehow, worth saving. It was a clean, sharp grief, a pain he chose to feel fully, without anesthetic. When he finally reached the container and pulled open the door, Zeus was there, tail giving a single, hopeful thump against the floor. Andy fell to his knees and wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in the gray and white fur that smelled of cold air and honest earth. No one saw his tears. There was no applause for his victory. But in the silent, cold container, surrounded by the wreckage of his life, Andy knew he had just won the most important fight he had ever faced. The morning after the victory no one saw was different. The air was just as cold, the light just as gray, but the crushing weight of despair had lifted. In its place was a quiet, fragile clarity. When Andy woke, the monster of his addiction was still there, but it was a distant growl, not a roar in his ear. He looked at Zeus, who was sleeping peacefully at the foot of his sleeping bag, and felt a surge of gratitude so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He had not been alone in that fight. Their morning patrol had a new energy. Andy walked with his head held a little higher, his steps more purposeful. He was no longer just a man enduring the passage of time. He was a man who had faced his own destruction and chosen to live. To clear his head and put more distance between himself and the town, he let Zeus lead them away from their usual perimeter and toward the dense stand of Douglas firs that bordered the back of the lot. The forest floor was a soft carpet of pine needles and damp earth. As they moved deeper into the woods, a change came over Zeus. His leisurely pace tightened. His ears swiveled, catching sounds Andy could not hear. His nose, always testing the air, began to twitch with a new intensity. It was a subtle shift, but Andy, who knew the dog better than he knew himself, recognized it instantly. This was not a pet exploring the woods. This was the highly trained military working dog, his partner, on a mission. Suddenly, Zeus froze. His body went rigid, his tail straight and low. He had found something. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he took a few cautious steps forward toward the base of an ancient, moss-covered oak tree. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he began to dig, his powerful front paws sending dirt and roots flying. "Zeus, what is it? What did you find, boy?" Andy said, his voice quiet. The dog ignored him, his focus absolute. Andy's curiosity overcame his caution. He knelt beside his partner, peering at the rapidly growing hole. He thought perhaps it was an animal's den, but Zeus's professional intensity told him otherwise. This was different. This was a detection. He began digging with his bare hands, the cold, damp soil numbing his fingertips. A few inches down, his fingers hit something hard and flat. Wood. Working together, man and dog clawed away the remaining earth until the corner of a dark, heavy box was exposed. It was an old military footlocker, its green paint faded and peeling, its metal clasps thick with rust. It took all of Andy's strength to work it free from the grip of the roots and soil. It was heavy, waterlogged, and smelled of the deep earth. They dragged it together, step by painful step, back to the clearing in front of the container. Andy's heart hammered in his chest, a feeling he hadn't felt in years, anticipation. With a piece of scrap metal as a lever, he pried at the rusted latches. They groaned and resisted before one, then the other, snapped open with a sharp crack. He lifted the heavy lid. The contents were not a perfect treasure. A wave of musty, damp air rose to meet him. The top layer was a rotted canvas tarp, dark with mildew. Beneath it, a heartbreaking sight: the corroded, skeletal remains of what had once been a power drill and a circular saw, destroyed by years of moisture. A flicker of disappointment stung him, but then he dug deeper. Beneath the ruined power tools, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly held, were the heavy, solid shapes of hand tools. He lifted them out one by one. A 20-ounce framing hammer, its head coated in a thick layer of orange rust, but its shape still true. A set of forged steel wrenches, their sizes still legible beneath the corrosion. A long, sturdy pry bar. And a handsaw, its blade spotted with rust but still straight and menacing. These were not cheap, modern tools. They were old, American-made steel, built to last. As a combat engineer, Andy knew them intimately. He felt the familiar weight of the hammer in his hand, the perfect balance of it. He ran a thumb over the teeth of the saw. They were dull, but could be sharpened. This was not a complete set. It was not an easy fix. But it was a start. It was a tangible, physical spark of hope. That afternoon, the silent war found a new battlefield. Andy sat on the ground outside his container, the salvaged tools laid out before him on a clean cloth. He took out a small whetstone and a can of lubricating oil he had kept from his old life, along with a piece of sandpaper. He chose the hammer first. He began to work, his movements slow and meticulous. He scraped away the thickest layers of rust, then began the rhythmic, repetitive work of sanding. Back and forth, his hands moved with a purpose they had not known for years. The grating sound of the sandpaper against the steel was the only sound in the quiet lot. With each stroke, he was not just cleaning a tool, he was scraping away at his own corrosion. Each flake of orange rust that fell away was a layer of his own shame and failure being shed. The process was agonizingly slow, and he knew the hammer would never look brand new. It would always bear the pitted scars of its time, buried in the dark, but it would be strong again. It would be useful again. He worked until his fingers were raw and the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He held up the hammerhead. In the fading light, the steel gleamed, dull but clean and impossibly strong. He looked from the restored tool to his own calloused, dirty hands, and for the first time in a very long time, he saw not a broken man, but a builder. The restored tools were a testament to his renewed will, but will alone could not fill an empty stomach or purchase a single nail. With the hope came a new, pressing anxiety. The small bag of rice was gone, the beans were down to a handful, and the kibble for Zeus was alarmingly low. Andy had the means to build, but he had nothing to build with, and no resources to sustain himself while he did it. The project, and their survival, depended on his ability to turn his skills into cash. For a man who had spent weeks hiding from the world, the thought of seeking work was daunting. It meant interaction, judgment, and the potential for rejection. But the quiet determination that had helped him turn his back on the liquor store now pushed him forward. He was a builder, a Marine combat engineer. He had a trade. For the first time in years, he felt he had something of value to offer. He found a flat, clean piece of cardboard and, using a marker he found in his old military rucksack, he carefully wrote a simple sign. The letters were blocky and precise. Handyman work, fences, sheds, small repairs. He didn't have a phone number to list, so he simply added his location at the bottom. Rust Container, Oak Haven Lot. He walked into the small town of Oak Haven, a journey that felt miles longer than the actual distance, and pinned his sign to the community bulletin board outside the feed store. Then he walked back, feeling exposed and vulnerable, and all he could do was wait. 2 days passed. The silence from the outside world was deafening. The hunger in his stomach grew into a dull, constant ache. He began to think it had been a foolish idea that no one would trust the strange man in the container. He was outside, sharpening the blade of the handsaw, when a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see an older man standing at the edge of his lot. He was likely in his 70s, with a slight stoop to his shoulders, but hands that were large, gnarled, and looked immensely capable. He wore clean denim overalls and a thoughtful, serious expression on his deeply lined face. He was a man who looked like he measured twice and cut once, in both carpentry and in judgment. "You the fella doing handyman work?" the man asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Andy stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Yes, sir, I am." The man nodded, his eyes scanning the lot, taking in the neatly organized restored tools, the tidiness of the campsite, and Zeus, who sat calmly a few feet away, watching the visitor with intelligent, unblinking eyes. "Name's Miller," the man said. "I live just down the road, the big white house with the blue trim. I'm a retired carpenter." He paused, his gaze landing on the saw in Andy's hand. "That's a good saw. Old steel." "It'll do the job," Andy replied quietly. "Got a job for you, if you're interested," Mr. Miller continued, getting straight to the point. "Last storm took a piece of my porch roof with it, ripped a few boards clean off, and damaged the joist underneath. I'd do it myself, but my back isn't what it used to be. Think you can handle it?" It was a test. Andy knew it. He wasn't just being asked if he could do the work. He was being asked if he knew what he was doing. "I'd have to see the damage," Andy said. "But, yes, I can handle it." They walked to Mr. Miller's house. The porch roof was exactly as he'd described. Andy assessed the damage with a professional eye, pointing out the split in the joist and the best way to secure it before replacing the boards. He spoke quietly, but with the unmistakable confidence of a man who understood the geometry of wood and stress. Mr. Miller listened, nodding slowly, his sharp eyes missing nothing. They agreed on a small, fair price, to be paid in cash upon completion. The next morning, Andy was at Mr. Miller's house at sunrise. The older man had left out the new lumber, a toolbox, and a thermos of hot coffee. Andy drank the coffee, a warmth spreading through him that was more than just heat, and then he set to work. All day, the sounds of purposeful labor filled the air, the clean rasp of a saw cutting through new wood, the sharp, rhythmic reports of a hammer striking nails. Andy worked with a focused, quiet intensity that was almost a form of meditation. Up on the ladder, with the sun on his back, he was not the broken man from the container. He was a craftsman. He was in his element. All the noise in his head, the guilt, the shame, the craving, all of it went silent, replaced by the simple, honest logic of the task at hand. Zeus lay in the grass at the bottom of the ladder, a silent, watchful guardian. From his kitchen window, Mr. Miller watched as well. He saw the precision in Andy's cuts, the efficiency of his movements, the care he took to ensure every board was perfectly flush. He saw a professional at work. By late afternoon, the job was done. The new section of the roof blended seamlessly with the old. It was strong, clean, and expertly repaired. Andy cleaned up every speck of sawdust, leaving the workspace immaculate. Mr. Miller came out and inspected the work, running a calloused hand over the new boards. He looked at the tight seams, the perfectly aligned nails. He looked up at Andy, who stood waiting quietly, and for the first time, a look of genuine respect softened the old carpenter's gruff features. "Good work," he said. It was the highest form of praise. He handed Andy the agreed-upon cash, folded neatly. "Damn good work." Andy walked back to his lot, the crumpled bills in his pocket, feeling heavier than gold. It was more than money. It was proof. It was earned dignity. His first stop was the feed store. He walked past the aisles of cheap beer and wine without a second glance. He went straight to the pet food section and bought the largest bag of the high-quality food he knew Zeus loved. Only after it was paid for did he walk to the grocery section. He bought a bag of beans, a loaf of bread, some potatoes, and a small package of ground beef. That evening, for the first time since they had arrived in Oregon, they ate a real meal. Andy cooked the meat and potatoes over his small fire, sharing a portion with Zeus. They ate together, as the sun set, the air growing cool around them. For the first time, the container behind them looked less like a prison and more like the beginning of a home. The small sum of money from Mr. Miller's job felt like a fortune. It was the first currency of his new life, earned through his own skill and sweat. It allowed him to purchase necessities, but more importantly, it gave him the resources to truly begin his project. He spent a portion of it on heavy-duty wire brushes, primer, and a can of rust-inhibiting paint. The therapy of the hammer was replaced by the therapy of restoration. He started on the side of the container that faced the road, wanting to erase the most visible scars first. The work was grueling. Scraping away years of corrosion was a monotonous, physically demanding task that left his arms and back screaming in protest. But with every patch of rust that he conquered, revealing the dull gray steel beneath, he felt a deep and satisfying sense of progress. He was not just cleaning a box, he was claiming it. It was during the third afternoon of this work that Zeus lifted his head from his paws and let out a single, low woof. Andy stopped, his body instantly tense. He looked up and saw the woman from the rose garden, Rachel, walking slowly across the field that separated her property from his. She was carrying a covered casserole dish, and her steps were gentle and unhurried. Andy's first instinct was to retreat, to disappear inside the container and pretend he wasn't there. He was a creature of isolation, and unexpected human contact felt like a threat. But he had won a victory against that urge to flee just a week ago, and he would not surrender now. He stood his ground, leaning against the container, his posture defensive, his face a mask of neutrality. As she drew closer, he could see her more clearly. Her short white hair was tidy, and her eyes, surrounded by the fine lines of a life fully lived, were a warm, intelligent hazel. She wore a simple cardigan and gardening gloves, and moved with a quiet grace. She stopped a respectful distance away, offering a small, kind smile that did not feel intrusive. Zeus remained where he was, watching her calmly, sensing no threat. "Hello there," she said, her voice pleasant and clear. "I hope I'm not disturbing your work." "No, ma'am," Andy replied, his voice rough from disuse. "My name is Rachel. I live right over there," she said, gesturing with her head toward the house with the roses. "I've seen you out here every day. You are working so hard." Andy just nodded, unsure what to say. He was braced for the questions, the pity, the veiled curiosity. "Why are you here? What happened to you?" But the questions never came. Instead, Rachel's gaze softened as she looked at Zeus. "And I have to say," she continued warmly, "your partner is one of the most handsome gentlemen I have ever seen. He's a German shepherd, isn't he?" The unexpected compliment, directed at his dog, disarmed Andy completely. The tension in his shoulders eased a fraction. "Yes, ma'am. His name is Zeus." "Zeus. What a wonderful, strong name. He seems very well behaved." "He is," Andy said, a flicker of pride in his voice. "He was a military working dog. He's retired now." Rachel's eyes widened slightly with understanding and a new level of respect. "Oh," she said softly, "a veteran. Both of you, then." "It is Omet." She had not asked. She had understood. The simple statement hung in the air, a recognition of his past without any of the intrusive questions that usually followed. It was a gesture of profound respect. She then looked down at the dish in her hands. "Well, I won't keep you. I was making lasagna for dinner, and, as usual, my eyes were bigger than my stomach. I made far too much. I was thinking that a man who works as hard as you do could probably use a hot meal." She held it out to him. "Please. I'd hate for it to go to waste." Andy stared at the dish. It wasn't an act of charity. It was a simple, neighborly offering, phrased in a way that allowed him to accept it without feeling like a beggar. He hesitated for a long moment, the deeply ingrained habit of refusing help warring with the simple, human need for connection. He finally stepped forward and took the dish, its warmth seeping through the towel and into his calloused hands. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling foreign but necessary. "Thank you, Rachel." "You are most welcome, Andy," she replied, having learned his name from Mr. Miller. She smiled once more, gave a little nod to Zeus, and then turned and walked back toward her home. Andy stood there for a long time, holding the warm casserole dish, watching her go. He felt a strange cracking sensation deep inside him, like a frozen river beginning to thaw. He had built his walls so high to protect himself, but she had not tried to tear them down. She had simply opened a gate he had forgotten was even there. That evening, he heated the lasagna on his camp stove. The rich aroma of garlic, tomato, and cheese filled the small clearing, a scent of home and hearth that felt like a memory from another lifetime. He put a generous portion in Zeus's bowl, mixed with his kibble, and served himself. He sat on the ground, leaning against the container wall that he had just cleaned, and ate the best meal he had tasted in years. It was more than just food. It was acceptance. It was a message, delivered without judgment, that he was not invisible, that his efforts were seen, that he was, perhaps, not as alone as he thought. The unconditional loyalty of his dog had saved his life. But the simple, unconditional kindness of a stranger had just given him a reason to start truly living it. The kindness Rachel had shown him acted as a balm on Andy's wounded spirit, and the days that followed were filled with a quiet, steady purpose. The small jobs for neighbors, earned through Mr. Miller's respectful recommendation, provided a trickle of income that kept him and Zeus fed and allowed him to buy materials. The container was slowly beginning to transform under his skilled hands, the sounds of his work becoming a familiar rhythm in the Oak Haven neighborhood. The change in the season was subtle at first, a sharper bite in the morning air, a deeper gold in the afternoon light. One evening, the sky turned a bruised, heavy purple. The wind began to howl through the fir trees, a low, mournful sound that promised a storm. Andy secured his tools and a loose tarp, the movements born of military discipline. Inside the container, the first drops of rain sounded like pebbles thrown against the roof. Soon, it was a deafening roar, the steel box amplifying the storm's fury into a constant, vibrating thunder. Zeus, who was normally unnerved by loud noises, lay calmly at Andy's feet, seeming to draw strength from his human's composure. For Andy, the storm was not a threat. It was just noise. He had lived through far worse. He sat in the dark, listening to the tempest, a strange sense of peace settling over him. He was safe. He was sober. He was home. The storm broke just before dawn. When Andy opened the door, the world was washed clean, dripping and gleaming in the pale morning light. The air smelled of rain and wet earth. After their simple breakfast, they began their daily patrol. As they neared Rachel's property, Andy heard it. A voice, thin and tight with panic, calling a name over and over. "Patches. Here. Kitty, kitty. Patches." He saw Rachel moving frantically through her yard, her face etched with worry. She checked under the porch, behind her rose bushes, her movements growing more desperate. Andy's old instinct to remain invisible, to not get involved, tugged at him, but the memory of her kindness, of the warm lasagna, was stronger. He walked toward her fence line. "Rachel," he called out, "is everything all right?" She looked up, her eyes wide with distress. "Oh, Andy, it's Patches, my cat. He always comes inside when a storm is coming, but he didn't last night. I was sure he'd be on the porch this morning, but he's gone. I've looked everywhere." Andy's gaze swept over the yard and the woods beyond, now a tangled mess of fallen branches from the storm. "What does he look like?" "He's an old boy," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Orange and white, a bit plump. He's not very adventurous. He never wanders far." She wrung her hands. With all this debris, he could be trapped somewhere, or hurt. Ismar. Andy looked down at Zeus, who stood watching the scene with calm, intelligent eyes. He thought of the dog's focus in the woods, the unwavering skill that had led them to the tool chest. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. "Let me try something," Andy said, his voice quiet but firm. "Zeus is a trained tracker. If you have something with your cat's scent on it, a blanket or a toy, he might be able to find a trail. A flicker of hope ignited in Rachel's eyes. She rushed inside and returned a moment later with a small, soft blanket. "This is his favorite," she said, handing it to Andy. Andy knelt in front of his partner. "Zeus," he said, his voice shifting into the tone of a command. "Find." He held the blanket to the dog's nose. Zeus inhaled the scent deeply, his entire demeanor changing in an instant. The companion vanished, and the professional took over. His body tensed with purpose, his nose dropped to the damp ground, and he began to cast back and forth in a methodical, grid-like pattern. Rachel watched in stunned silence. Mr. Miller, who had come out to inspect his own yard for damage, saw the scene and walked over, his expression curious. Zeus ignored them all. He picked up a scent near the back of Rachel's garden and began to move with confidence, following a path invisible to the humans. The trail led them away from the house, past the edge of the woods, and toward a small, gurgling creek that was swollen from the night's rain. At the edge of the creek was a large concrete drainage pipe, half submerged in the rushing water. Zeus stopped at the mouth of the pipe and let out a sharp, definitive bark. Andy's heart pounded. He peered into the dark opening. At first, he saw nothing. Then, he heard a faint, terrified meow. Deep inside, huddled on a small ledge just above the waterline, was a terrified ball of orange and white fur. Patches had likely taken shelter from the storm inside the pipe, only to be trapped when the water level rose. "He's in here," Andy called back to Rachel and Mr. Miller, who had followed at a distance. "He's alive, just scared." The pipe was too narrow for Andy to crawl through. Thinking quickly, he grabbed a long, sturdy, fallen branch. "It's okay, buddy," he said in a low, soothing voice. "We're getting you out." He carefully extended the branch into the pipe until it was just in front of the cat. "Come on, climb on," he coaxed. Terrified, the cat hesitated. Zeus let out another soft bark, a sound that was strangely encouraging. After a long moment, Patches tentatively reached out a paw, then another, and began to slowly inch his way along the branch. Andy pulled it back with painstaking slowness until the drenched and shivering cat was within reach. He gently scooped him up, wrapping him in his own flannel shirt. When he walked back to Rachel, with Zeus trotting proudly at his side, she was crying, this time with tears of pure relief. Mr. Miller stood beside her, shaking his head in quiet amazement. "Oh, Patches," Rachel sobbed, taking her cat and holding him close. She looked at Andy, her eyes shining with gratitude that left her speechless. "It was all him," Andy said, placing a hand on Zeus's head. "He's the hero." Rachel simply reached out and put a hand on Andy's arm. "No," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You both are." Mr. Miller gave a slow, respectful nod. "That's one hell of a dog you've got there, Andy." In that moment, standing in the morning sun, Andy felt the last of the invisible walls around him crumble into dust. He was no longer the strange man in the container. He was Andy, the man who had helped. He was the man with the hero dog. He was, finally and completely, their neighbor. The story of the four-legged hero and his quiet, capable owner spread through Oakhaven like a gentle breeze. The rescue of Patches was the final piece of evidence the community needed. They had seen Andy's discipline and his tireless work ethic. Now, they had seen his kindness and his courage. The invisible wall that had separated him from his neighbors did not just crack. It dissolved completely. His morning walks with Zeus were different now. The curtain twitching had been replaced by friendly waves from front porches. Passing drivers would lift a hand from the steering wheel in a gesture of greeting. The wariness in people's eyes was gone, replaced by a warm and open curiosity. For Andy, who had lived in a shroud of anonymity and shame for so long, this simple acceptance was both unnerving and profoundly moving. The help, when it came, arrived not as charity, but as a series of sincere, practical offerings. A few days after the rescue, Mr. Miller's old pickup truck rumbled to a stop at the edge of the lot. In the back was a neat stack of cedar planks. "Had these left over from a deck I built last year," Mr. Miller said, his tone gruff as ever, though his eyes were kind. "Good wood. Too good to use for firewood. Figured you could use it for that porch you're planning." Andy looked at the beautiful, fragrant wood, then back at the old carpenter. His first instinct, born of pride and a deep-seated feeling of unworthiness, was to refuse. But he saw in Mr. Miller's face not pity, but an offering of respect from one craftsman to another. Learning to accept was a new, unfamiliar battle. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Miller," Andy said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "Don't thank me," the old man grunted. "Just put it to good use." That act of generosity seemed to open a floodgate. A few days later, a younger couple stopped by and dropped off 3 half-full cans of high-quality exterior paint in a pleasant forest green. "We just finished painting our trim and this was going to go to waste," the husband explained with a friendly shrug. Rachel would often leave a small bag of fresh vegetables from her garden by his path, with a simple note that said, "Enjoy." The help was more than just material. People began to stop by simply to talk. They would admire his progress on the container, ask questions about his techniques, and offer words of encouragement. Most of all, they came to see Zeus. The big, handsome shepherd had become a local celebrity, accepting pats on the head and quiet praise with a noble dignity. Each conversation was a small act of healing for Andy. He spoke more in those few weeks than he had in the entire previous year. He learned the names of his neighbors, heard stories about their families, and slowly, cautiously, began to feel like he was part of something again. He was learning to accept their kindness, and in doing so, he was subconsciously learning that perhaps he was worthy of it. He was beginning to forgive himself. One afternoon, as he was framing a window opening with the cedar planks from Mr. Miller, the local mail carrier's vehicle pulled up. Since he had started getting odd jobs, he had installed a simple post box at the end of his path. The carrier, a cheerful woman named Patty, handed him a small stack of mail. "Looks like you got an official one today, Andy," she said, pointing to a long white envelope with a government return address. Andy's heart froze. Department of Veterans Affairs. For months, this had been a source of anxiety, a symbol of the bureaucratic maze he had been too broken to navigate properly. A friend from his old unit had practically filled out the disability claim for him before he left Ohio, but Andy had held little hope. He waited until the mail truck had driven away before he opened it. He sat down on a stack of lumber, with Zeus resting his head on his knee as if sensing the importance of the moment. His hands, so steady with a hammer, trembled as he tore open the envelope. The language was formal, full of official jargon, but the message was clear. His claim for PTSD had been reviewed and approved. He was being granted a disability rating, and the corresponding monthly benefits would begin immediately. The letter also stated that a significant amount of back pay, covering the months since his claim was filed, would be deposited into his bank account within the week. Andy read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through a sudden film of tears. He had expected to feel a surge of relief, a sense of victory. Instead, the feeling was more complex and far deeper. The money was not a rescue. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he would have survived without it. He had already proven that to himself. He had faced his demons, found work, and begun to build a life with his own 2 hands. This was something different. This was a recognition. It was the system, the country he had served, finally acknowledging the invisible wounds he carried. It was a validation of his struggle and his sacrifice. The money meant he could buy proper insulation instead of scavenging for scraps. It meant he could afford a small used truck to haul materials. It meant he would never again have to worry about having enough money for a bag of dog food. It meant stability. It meant a future. He looked at the half-finished container, now being built with wood from a friend and soon to be painted with color from a neighbor. He looked at the official letter in his hand, a bridge to a secure future. He looked down at Zeus, his loyal partner, who had been the catalyst for it all. The crushing weight of guilt he had carried for so long, the feeling of being a failure, a disgrace, began to lift. It was not a sudden dramatic release, but a slow, quiet easing, like a heavy pack being gently unstrapped from his shoulders. He was not defined by his mistakes. He was a man who had served his country, a man who was a good neighbor, a man who had earned his place in the world. He was a man who deserved a second chance, and for the first time, he truly started to believe it. The arrival of the VA funds, combined with the unwavering support of his new friends, was like a powerful tailwind for Andy's project. The slow, painstaking progress of a scavenger was replaced by the efficient, focused work of a skilled engineer with the right resources. The transformation of the container, which had seemed impossible only a few months prior, now accelerated with breathtaking speed. The forest green paint, a gift from his neighbors, covered the last traces of rust, allowing the container to settle peacefully into the Oregon landscape. Using the beautiful cedar planks from Mr. Miller, Andy built a small, welcoming porch, just big enough for a chair and a sleeping dog. He installed a proper, double-paned window, and Rachel helped him plant a small garden bed near the steps with hardy perennials that would bring color year after year. From the outside, the container was no longer an object of curiosity or pity. It was a charming, rustic, tiny home, a testament to ingenuity and perseverance. The change inside was even more profound. Andy was now able to purchase high-quality insulation, which he fitted meticulously between the steel ribs of the container. The constant, seeping chill that had defined his early existence here vanished, replaced by a quiet, insulated peace. He paneled the walls and ceiling with warm, knotty pine, the fragrant scent of the wood chasing away the last ghostly smells of rust and decay. The hollow, metallic echo was gone, replaced by the soft, absorbent acoustics of a proper room. His engineering mind reveled in the challenge of the small space. He built clever, multifunctional furniture, a table folded down from the wall when needed and disappeared when it was not. Shelves and cabinets were built directly into the structure, providing ample storage without cluttering the floor. He installed a small, efficient wood-burning stove in one corner, its black pipe rising cleanly through the roof. In another, he constructed a compact kitchen counter with a small sink connected to a simple water system he had designed. Every square inch had a purpose. It was a space born of necessity, skill, and a newfound love for his work. Finally, the day came when all the major construction was done. The walls were finished, the floor was sealed, and the last of the furniture was in place. The container was a home. But there was one last, vital task to complete. It was the most important project of all. For this, he did not use leftover pine or salvaged wood. He took out the finest, straightest-grained cedar planks that Mr. Miller had given him, the ones he had set aside for a special purpose. This final piece of work would not be for himself. It was for Zeus. He worked with a reverence that bordered on ceremony. This was not just a dog bed, it was a monument to his Savior. As he measured and cut the fragrant wood, his mind drifted back through the past few months. He remembered the first night, the dog's warmth being the only thing between him and utter despair. He remembered Zeus dropping the empty food bowl at his feet, a simple act that had shattered his self-pity. He remembered the unwavering trust in the dog's eyes as they stood at the precipice of a new life. Zeus had been his anchor, his conscience, and his commander. He had been the entire reason for this new beginning. Andy sanded each piece of cedar until it was as smooth as silk, his hands tracing the beautiful lines of the wood. He built a low, sturdy frame, raised a few inches off the floor, to protect Zeus from any drafts. He designed it with a wide, open front, making it easy for an aging dog to get in and out. With a small carving knife, he carefully etched the name Zeus into the front panel, the letters simple and strong, just like the dog himself. He joined the pieces not with nails, but with sturdy traditional joinery that would last a lifetime. He finished it with a natural, non-toxic oil that brought out the rich, reddish tones of the wood. When it was finished, it was more than just a bed. It was a throne. He carried it inside and placed it in the most honored place in the small home, the warm, protected corner beside the wood stove, a spot from which Zeus could comfortably watch over his entire domain, including the door and his human. Andy went into town and used his funds to buy a thick orthopedic cushion designed for large dogs, fitting it perfectly into the cedar frame. Everything was ready. "Zeus," he called softly, "come on, boy. I've got something for you." The big shepherd padded inside, his claws clicking softly on the new floor. He saw the bed and approached it cautiously, his nose twitching as he took in the new smells of cedar and clean fabric. He circled it once, a ritual of inspection, and then, with a deep, contented sigh that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul, he stepped into the frame and settled down onto the thick cushion. He rested his head on his paws and looked up at Andy, his golden eyes blinking slowly, a look of perfect, absolute peace on his noble face. Andy stood there, watching his friend, and felt a profound sense of completion. He looked around the small, warm room. He saw the pine walls glowing in the lamplight, the neat shelves holding his few possessions, the functional little kitchen, and the comfortable bed in the corner where he himself would sleep. But the heart of the home, its true center, was the corner where his loyal partner now rested in comfort and security. The container was no longer a cold, empty steel box. It was filled with warmth, with purpose, and with a quiet, resilient love. It was no longer just a structure. It finally had a soul. Spring arrived in the Willamette Valley not as a quiet suggestion, but as a vibrant, undeniable declaration of life. The bleak, skeletal trees that had framed Andy's first months in Oregon were now dressed in 1,000 shades of brilliant green. The small garden bed Rachel had helped him plant exploded with color, daffodils and tulips standing like cheerful soldiers in the morning sun. The air, once heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, was now sweet with the fragrance of blossoms and new grass. Andy's home, once a rusty scar on the landscape, had become a beautiful part of it. The forest green paint helped it blend with the surrounding trees, and the cedar porch had weathered to a soft, silvery gray. It looked as though it had always been there, a quiet, resilient little sanctuary nestled at the edge of the woods. He sat on that porch, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, and watched the world wake up. His life had found a new rhythm, one of peace and gentle routine. He was no longer a ghost haunting the edge of town. He was a member of the Oakhaven community. His handyman business, built on the foundation of Mr. Miller's respect, kept him busy but never overwhelmed. People trusted him, and they valued his quiet, meticulous work. Zeus dozed at his feet, his gray and white coat gleaming in the sun. The old dog's movements were a little stiffer now, but his spirit was content. He was the undisputed king of the neighborhood, receiving greetings and gentle pats from everyone who passed by. "Good morning, Andy," a voice called out. It was Rachel, tending to her roses on the other side of the field. "Morning, Rachel," Andy called back, his voice easy and clear. "Garden's looking beautiful." "It's the spring rain," she said with a laugh, "and a little bit of hard work. You two enjoy this lovely day." He lifted his mug in a silent salute. A few moments later, Mr. Miller's old truck rumbled past on the road, and the old carpenter gave him a friendly honk. Andy waved back. This was his life now. It was a life of simple connections, of quiet dignity, of a profound and hard-won peace. As he sipped his coffee, his gaze drifted from his small, perfect home to the woods beyond. His mind wandered back down the long, broken road that had brought him here. He thought of the man who had arrived on that bleak autumn day, a man hollowed out by grief, shame, and addiction. He remembered the shaking hands that could barely hold a cup, and he looked down at his own, steady and strong, calloused from honest work. He remembered the soul-crushing cold of the steel floor, and contrasted it with the gentle warmth of the sun on his face. He thought of that desperate walk to the edge of town, standing on the precipice of self-destruction, and he felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it took his breath away. Gratitude for the strength he hadn't known he possessed. Gratitude for the kindness of strangers who had become friends. And most of all, an overwhelming, boundless gratitude for the magnificent creature sleeping at his feet. He had built this home with his own hands, but Zeus had rebuilt the man inside it. The reflection settled something deep within him. For months, he had focused on building his future, walling off the ruins of his past. But now, sitting in the warm spring sun, he realized he was no longer afraid of the ghosts of Ohio. They no longer had any power over him. The peace he had found was not the fragile peace of a fugitive in hiding. It was the solid, unbreakable peace of a man who had won his war. And he knew there was one last bridge to build. He finished his coffee, gave Zeus a long, affectionate scratch behind the ears, and went inside. The interior of his home was warm and smelled of cedar and coffee. He sat down at the small, fold-down table he had built, a marvel of efficient design. From a drawer, he took out a single sheet of clean white paper and a pen. His hands, which had built walls and roofs and furniture with such confidence, felt clumsy and uncertain as he began to write. He was not writing to ask for forgiveness, or to make excuses, or to demand anything. He was simply reporting in, a soldier letting his family know he was still alive. He wrote, "Dear Sarah, I don't know if this letter will find you at the old address. I hope it does. I hope you and your family are well. I am writing to you from a small town in Oregon called Oak Haven. I wanted you to know that I am okay. It has been a long road, but I am sober now. I have been for some time. I built myself a small home here. I do handyman work for the folks in town. I am well. I think about you and Mom and Dad all the time. I know I caused you so much pain, and I live with that. I just wanted you to know that the man who caused that pain is gone. My partner is still with me. Zeus. He is a good dog. He saved my life. I don't expect a reply. I just needed to let you know. I hope you are happy. With love, your brother, Andy." He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into an envelope. He wrote her name and the old address in Ohio on the front, his handwriting clear and steady. He placed a stamp in the corner. He sat there for a long moment, the letter lying on the table, a silent testament to his journey. Outside, a bird began to sing. Zeus let out a soft sigh in his sleep from his comfortable bed in the corner. Andy looked out the window he had installed himself at the vibrant green world that was his new beginning. The past was no longer a place of shame to run from, but simply the place he had started. And for the first time, he felt truly, completely free. The story of Andy and Zeus reminds us that, sometimes, in our darkest moments, the steady presence of one loyal soul is the only lighthouse we need to guide us back to shore. If their incredible bond touched your heart, we hope you'll show your support with a like and share this story with someone who understands the power of a second chance. Please leave a comment below to tell us about a special animal who changed your life. Subscribing to our channel allows us to keep bringing these stories to light, and our newest one is waiting for you to click on the screen right now.